Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Tuleyome's September Nature and You lecture. My name is Jeff Ben. I'm the Education Associate at Tuleyome. If you don't know, Tuleyome is a small conservation nonprofit based in Woodland, California. Our mission is to engage in advocacy and active stewardship with diverse communities to conserve, enhance, restore, and enjoy the lands in our region. And the region that we focus on is the northern inner coast range and the neighboring areas of the Central Valley. In particular, we focus on the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument, which we helped get established back in 2015, and which we recently helped to expand. In addition to that public lands advocacy work, we also do a variety of other things, including education programs such as K-12 field trips, this monthly lecture series. We also do a variety of adventures programs, including hikes, trail building days, wildflower tours, and our youth boot bank program, which provides free loans of hiking boots to kids. If you'd like to learn more about any of those programs or upcoming events, you can do so at our website, tuleyome.org. All right, on to tonight's lecture. So this lecture series is supported by donations from folks like you. So if you're able to, and you haven't done so already, we'd greatly appreciate a donation to help support the program. So we are very lucky this month to have Cecilia Walsh from Tree Davis with us. Cecilia earned her bachelor's degree from UC Davis in environmental horticulture and urban forestry. At Tree Davis, she works to lead and help grow their urban forestry programs in Davis and in the surrounding communities. And tonight, she'll be talking to us about planting for our climate-ready future. And so during the talk, we ask that you keep your microphones muted and hang on to any questions until the end of the talk. And at the end, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. All right, so with that, Cecilia, the floor is yours.
All righty, thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Cecilia. I'm very grateful to be here today. Thank you to Jeff for having me. So we're going to be talking today about planting for our climate-ready futures. So why trees? Tree Davis, it's in our name, but why are they so important to work that we as an organization do? The trees have a lot of amazing benefits. Not only are they beautiful, but they interact with our environment in a variety of ways that are really beneficial. Let me go back there. So trees store and sequester carbon. They help clean the air pollutants produced by humans. They help in saving energy in homes and businesses. They can add value to your property if you're looking to sell it. And they also encourage communities to come out and support local small businesses if there's, shade in downtown areas. They help with stormwater management by decreasing runoff, creating habitat for wildlife, improving water retention and filtration, and they provide a variety of both mental and physical benefits for humans. Most often talked about when we talk about tree benefits is probably their effects with cooling. So cooling that trees provide are extremely important in urban areas because urban areas experience what is called the urban heat island effect. So this is a photo of the nice downtown Sacramento area. Sacramento, once lovingly referred to as the city of trees. You can see why it got its name. There's a lot of nice mature trees around this capital, but what you also see is a lot of tall concrete buildings. So the urban heat island effect, what happens is that, in the summer times that Davis, Sacramento, and the surrounding areas were so well known here for, the sun's rays are beating down on these tall buildings, and they're reflecting back into these urban areas that are often paved with more concrete and asphalt. So what happens is that then these materials capture heat and they tend to hold onto it. So you can see this graph kind of showcases what I'm talking about here. If we look at this red line, we're going to see surface temperatures and air temperatures during the day. And if we look at this blue line, we see surface and air temperatures during the night. So if we follow this across the x-axis here, we see a consistent trend that shows that both during the day and during the night, temperatures are higher in urban and downtown areas when compared to their neighboring rural and suburban areas. So when we look at areas most likely to be affected by the urban heat island effect, a majority of these areas are low-income neighborhoods. These areas are less likely to have high percentages of canopy cover, and the combined effects of these two things greatly impact communities. More often than not, these communities in the urban heat islands are the result of historic redlining and policies that limit social, economical, and environmental opportunities. So as climate change continues to impact us, it continues to impact these neighborhoods prolifically. It's having, kind of a combining outcome in them. So earlier when I talked about the benefits of just one tree, you can imagine the potential benefits if you have a so-called city of trees and that potential to impact change in areas that really need it. The American Forest Organization uses data from urban areas across the nation to evaluate tree canopies and assess inequities. So this is from their website, these tree equity scores. They have a map, so you can kind of go and look at any urban area and see the canopy cover. So you'll see various shades here. These green areas have higher tree scores, so that means there's more canopy cover, versus these more orange areas, they have lower canopy scores. So if we took a look at Sacramento over here, you can see the older and more affluent communities tend to have higher scores. And then if we go over and we look at Davis, Davis has a canopy coverage of about 26%, which is really, really good for a city. In Davis, we are very, very fortunate that our city has had the opportunity to invest so heavily in urban forestry across the last couple decades. But even in Davis, you can see these areas of lower canopy coverage. When we look at woodland as well, you see a similar pattern kind of emerge. So in comparison, you can kind of see how the canopy coverage can create inequities in urban areas. So now that we've looked at these areas, what can we do to address inequalities? Well, that's where urban forestry comes in. We work to raise awareness about the importance of trees in these areas through urban forestry. Urban forestry is the care and management of trees in urban settings for the purpose of improving the urban environment. As the name Tree Davis suggests, urban forestry is the heart of all the work that we do at Tree Davis. In our work, we work to plant, maintain, preserve trees, but we're also looking to engage communities and for opportunity to find local advocates to help them bring us into their neighborhoods and identify where we can help create the most change. So part of Tree Davis's mission is to continue engaging with these communities with lower canopy cover and helping to address inequities that exist. So now that you have a little bit of a background about trees and urban forestry, we're going to talk about what kind of things you're looking for when you're looking to select a tree. So in urban forestry, we have a common phrase, and that's the right tree, right place. So this kind of comes up in reference to species selection. So what am I talking about when I say species selection? Basically, we don't want to just pick a random tree and put it somewhere and hope it grows. In order to set up your tree for the best success, you're going to want to do what's called a site analysis. So this is a pretty regular part of my job. So when we're looking at a site, there's a couple of different things we're looking at. So we're going to look at soil condition. Oftentimes for my work, this will be a visual assessment. I'm taking a look at what's growing in the surrounding areas. I'm trying to see if it looks like soil retains water. Maybe it has good drainage. I'm also looking at exposure. So if an area is on the south side of the house with very little surrounding trees, that's a clue to me that that area is going to be getting consistent sun. So I need something a little bit more heat resistant, a little bit more drought resistant. Likewise, if I'm in an area with a park and there's going to be a lone tree planted on a hill, that's going to be something that might get windy. So maybe I want to select for trees that have a stronger branching structure. I want to look at what constraints does the space have. I will say this is a huge limiting factor when we're working in urban areas because of the way cities are built. Oftentimes they're not built with trees in mind. So a lot of times we have asphalt, a lot of times in newer residents, there's very limited planting space. So in order to protect utilities, to protect hardscaping infrastructure, it's really important that you choose an appropriate tree species. Another other thing you're going to want to look at is where are you located. So this is what hardiness zone has to do with. Hardiness zone has to do with how cold temperatures get. This isn't too much of an issue for us on the West Coast because we typically don't get freezing temperatures, but it's always a good idea to check either your Sunset Western Garden zone or your USDA zone to get an idea of what will really grow well in your area. And then human activity, because we are in urban areas, humans are always going to play a part in interacting with trees. So kind of take a guess of, what might you use that space for? What are other people going to want to use that space for? You can see in this photo here, this is a space that Tree Davis stewards over in West Davis. And you can see it's quite sunny. So these two trees here are the species, the Bubba Desert Willow. They're very drought tolerant, very heat resistant. And you can tell by the hoses that I have laid out here, there's no kind of irrigation in this space. So these are all reliant on hand watering, which is why it's really important that they're so drought tolerant. So now that we've kind of answered the question of looking at the right tree, right place, how are you going to suggest what tree you should plant? Well, let's take a look at some data really fast. This is data from a research that has been done in this last year. We looked at trees that were planted through a former grant Tree Davis received. So this was the Community Canopy Grant. We planted over 1,000 trees in Davis in over 3 years. And we planted a variety of species that kind of broke up into 3 different categories. So we had climate-ready species, common species, and native oaks. The climate-ready species I'll get into a little more depth in a second, but common trees refer to trees that have historically done well in Davis and trees that are quite popular in the nursery trade. And native oaks are pretty self-explanatory. Those are our blue oaks, our valley oaks. So what this data shows, if we look at this graph here, we're looking at probability of survival. So essentially, this dot is what are the chances that any climate-ready tree, once planted, survives. And so you can see this is close to 95% survival rate, versus when we look at common trees, it's quite a lower survival rate. And one thing I will say is that throughout the course of this grant, we were using species selection. So climate-ready trees were more often placed in situations where there was less water and more heat. And so even with these things taken into account, they still tended to outperform their common counterparts. So climate-ready trees. Climate-ready trees are a promising new species that are adapted to handle California's changing climate. So as we know, we've already been seeing the effects of this, but in California, we expect to see continued trends of increased temperatures and decreased rainfall. So this research was started quite a few years ago. It started as a collaboration between the US Forest Service and UC Davis. And they've released some really great papers. If this is something you're interested in, I would really recommend go checking those out. But kind of where Tree Davis came into play is that we started shifting towards planting a palette in Davis of these climate-ready trees. As I mentioned, that Community Canopy Grant, we planted a mix of those climate-ready and common species. I can say firsthand that the climate-ready species have done extremely well. The oldest trees as part of that grant is 5 years old now. So they're kind of just exiting their younger years into their juvenile, more mature years. And they're really beautiful trees. So something to kind of note, a lot of these species are not native to California, but they do show increased resilience, and they were specifically selected for the resilience to high temperatures and drought. So here's an example of a couple of climate-ready trees that were studied through this research. So on this left-hand side here, we have the emerald sunshine elm. A lot of you might be familiar with either the English elms or the American elms, which were particularly in Sacramento widely planted in the 40s. That is kind of halted because elms are very susceptible to Dutch elm disease. So this is a newer cultivar. It's native to Asia, but it's been selected because it did really well in kind of Oklahoma and really arid areas. So this species is resistant to Dutch elm disease and the elm leaf beetle. It's a really great tree because it has a very fast growth rate. So this is an awesome species to put in anywhere where you're like really wanting shade really fast. In the middle here, we have the canby oak. So this is also sometimes called the Chisos oak. It's a type of red oak that is partly deciduous. Sometimes it loses its leaves in the summer, late summer. But this is native to Texas and northeast parts of Mexico. If you go in and you look at the climate ready tree palette, you'll notice a lot of these trees are native to New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma. So we're looking at these kind of drier regions to model what we're predicting California's climate to be, and potentially 100 years from now or so. But it's a really beautiful tree. It kind of has that evergreen look of some of the other oaks, really small under leaves, but great branching structure. And then on this side, we have the white shield Osage orange. If any of you are familiar with the Osage orange, they produce this like softball sized fruit, which is kind of crazy. They are not edible like readily. So this is a fruitless and thornless cultivar, which is especially nice for using in urban settings. And this tree is native to Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. It's low maintenance. It does have kind of a base-like growth pattern, which means it can be kind of narrow in its growth. But we like to use this as a medium tree that has been very adaptable. I would say we planted this in some of like the driest, clayest, most compact Davis soils, and it has proceeded to like grow very, very well. So that's just to kind of share a few of these species with you, give you an idea of what we talk about when we're talking about climate ready species. A wonderful resource that I use every day at work is Selectree. And so this is put together by Cal Poly Urban Forestry Ecosystem Institute. And it's essentially a database of trees. So you can go in here, you can look up any of the trees that I just shared with you, type it into the search bar there, and it'll tell you size, how much water does it need, how much light does a tree need. It may give you a little bit of history, growth rates. Another really great tool you can use is if you're looking to plant a tree, once you do your site analysis, if you come over here and you hit search characteristics, you can identify some of those things you identified in your site analysis and pull that in and then put in the zip code where you're currently located. And Selectree will pull up a list of trees that do well in that area and fit your criteria. In my experience using Selectree, data is kind of pulled a little bit from all over. So specifically, like irrigation can be the biggest factor in determining whether a tree survives, right? Because roots are the most important part of a tree. So I really also recommend using UC Davis's database loopholes. So this will give you water use for a huge variety of species, both trees and shrubs. So it's a wonderful tool to have and use. And I always like to use it to double check Selectree's information on water use whenever possible. So now you've identified a site type, perhaps you've selected a tree. So how do you plant it? Like I said, selecting a tree is a big part of ensuring your tree does well. But all the things that kind of lead up to making sure your tree's in the ground are going to ensure its success. So planting a tree well starts with good nursery stock. So you can see this photo. This is a pretty aggressive root system. This is a bloodgood sycamore that was planted in Davis about 3 years ago. And we took this out of the pot. We had a really hard time getting it out of the pot because the roots were growing through the bottom of the pot. And this is kind of probably one of the worst cases I've seen of just really, really vigorous roots. This oftentimes happens when, nurseries have so much stock, it can be difficult for them to circulate it. So this tree should have moved into a bigger pot a long time ago. So when you, as a homeowner, are looking to select tree, it's really important that you carefully select your tree. So there's a couple things you can look for. You want to see that your tree has a good single leader. This applies to most trees, although smaller species sometimes have a tendency to be multi-stemmed. So it's okay if you can't find one for smaller species, such as like an Oklahoma redbud or those desert willows that I showed previously. But if you're selecting something like an oak, the canby oak that I showed You want to make sure it has one kind of vertical, good straight branch that's eventually going to develop into your trunk. Another thing to look for is to make sure that there are no wounds on the main trunk, broken branches. There may be signs of pruning from the nursery, but all the pruning cuts that happen to the tree, they should look pretty clean. If you're seeing anything really wonky, anything cut back very far, really big wounds, that might be a sign you want to select a different species. And then, of course, the part most people forget about, you want to look at the roots. So roots should not twist or circle in a container. This is what's referred to girdling. I have a couple examples of this in the next slide, but there should be a mix of fine and larger roots, maybe not as many large roots as this guy. And the roots should be relatively healthy. That's one thing I can say about this tree. The roots look healthy. They're this nice kind of like light white color. So here's a couple examples of bad nursery stock we've gotten over the years. So we'll start up here. So you can see this is a root on the white Giotto sage orange. Kind of an interesting fact, its roots are orange. So that can be a little bit like unnerving when you first see it. But the main issue is that this root has wrapped itself around the trunk of the tree. In its lifetime, this root is not going to move by itself. It's hard, it's firm, it's grown this way. So what's going to happen over time, this root won't move, but that trunk's going to continue to grow outward. So at a certain point, this root will kill this tree. And you see it happen. Sometimes you'll be walking around, maybe you see a tree right next to the sidewalk. The roots have nowhere to go, so they start growing back into the tree. And it can be a huge cause of death in trees. This one here, you can see this is a really large root. It's kind of up in the surface. The main issue with this root is that it's growing back into itself. So we don't want that. This is a species of oak. So it's very difficult to grow oak trees well. We typically buy trees in 15-gallon pot size, so they're about 2 feet deep or so. But oftentimes, you know, oak trees have tap roots. They're very vigorous. They want to grow down. So we have a lot of issues finding good oak stock because the taproot will start growing down, and then once it hits the bottom of the pot, it just grows right back up. Down here, you can see these roots are growing through the bottom of the pot. I would say if I had to select a tree out of this group, I would probably select this one. It's not too bad, but if I had another choice, I would pick a different tree. And then this tree, you're kind of seeing the opposite of what that blood-good sycamore was. These roots, they're very sparse. This was also a 15-gallon pot, so I pulled that tree out of a pot this size, and those roots made up less than half of the container. And all the roots were very dry, very brittle. You can see they're a dark color, which means most of them are dead. So now you have a good tree stock, hopefully. Hopefully you've selected from a better lot than the one I just showed. So when we're planting a tree, we're looking to plant this in the dormant season. This is the perfect time right now. We're wrapping around the fall. It is a little warm right now. I will say I'm doing a planting this Saturday. As an organization, that's from a time constraint standpoint. If you're looking to plant your own tree, I would recommend waiting another 2 months or so. Once you start to see colors on the leaves change and trees start to lose their leaves, that's probably a good time. But generally, we're looking at like October into early April. This can be very dependent year to year. But dormant season is the time to plant for most container trees. Larger trees, sometimes you'll see these planted in construction settings. So if you've ever seen like the big ball and burlap or trees in huge boxes, construction sites like to plant those because you get that immediate factor of a tree has been planted right away. But oftentimes we recommend smaller sizes. There's been research done on this to show that a 5-gallon tree planted at the same time next to a 15-gallon tree can catch up in size to that 15-gallon tree in 3 years, and then goes on to surpass it in size the next year. When you're planting a new tree, regardless of kind of rainfall, you're going to want to make sure to take in irrigation immediately. So once that tree's in the ground, you're going to want to start watering it in and make sure you're providing consistent watering. Otherwise, you can get transplant shock, which is when the tree, because you've changed its surroundings so drastically, will start to kind of shut down. And then anytime you're looking to dig, we always recommend 811, call before you dig. What 811 does is you can go to this website. They have some really great resources for homeowners, but you can either call 811 or now they have an online ticket submission system. So what you do is you say, this is where I'm looking to plant my tree. And then various utilities in the area like PG&E, Comcast, AT&T, they'll identify if there's any underground utilities. We always recommend this. You know, there are situations where people have planted trees over sewer or water lines. And because of the nature of the trees, if, you know, those pipes start to leak, roots don't know that sewage, that's water, that's pipe, it's not supposed to go into it. They just know roots like water. So they'll start to grow into it and it can cause major infrastructures for your home. So definitely make sure you call 811 before you dig. So once you've done that process and you're looking to actually plant your tree. So the first thing you're gonna wanna do is identify your tree's trunk flare. You don't wanna assume that when you buy a container from the nursery, that where the soil level is the beginning of your tree. You're gonna wanna dig around a little bit near the base of the trunk and find where the tree actually flares out. And typically you'll be able to see the first woody root that really starts from that flare. So you're gonna wanna find that first, kind of keep it in mind as you start digging your hole. When we dig holes, we like to do them 1.5 to 2 times the size of your container. So if you're planting a 5-gallon, that's maybe 8 inches in diameter, you're going to look to go at least 16 inches in diameter. When we're looking to dig holes, you're going to want to dig it kind of in the shape of a bowl, so gently sloping inwards. And if you over dig your hole, that's okay. You can fill it in with, backfill it with soil. But the most important thing you can do when you're planting a tree is to ensure that trunk flare is at the right level. So once you dug your hole to what you think is the appropriate size, you're going to go ahead and remove your tree from the container. You're going to look at the root ball, try and identify anything that we might have talked about in that nursery slide. It's really important. You can be pretty aggressive with the root system. When we do volunteer events showing people how to plant trees, people can get kind of freaked out. We'll go in there with pruners, we'll cut out roots that are doing that girdling. We'll go in with a saw and cut off, the outer layer of roots. So it's really important. This is the only time you'll ever see your roots before you put it in the hole and just kind of let your tree go. So double check your roots, double check your root flare to ensure it's still visible. Then you're going to place your tree in that hole and make sure that the start of the trunk flare is just visible above the base of your hole, level kind of with your hole. So check your height. You can always lay a shovel, perhaps lay the nursery stake over the hole, spend some good time on this, because as I said, it's the most important part of planting the tree. So once that's done, you can straighten your tree, position it. I always like to kind of take a look at the branching structure. So if you have a branch that looks like it's pretty vigorous, maybe you don't want that going towards your neighbor's fence. Maybe it's best for it to grow, away from your house. So do that while you kind of have an idea and before your tree has really established its roots. And then you can backfill your hole. You're going to mix it. You're probably going to have some potting soil that you took out when you were looking at the roots. So you can kind of mix that back in with the native soil. Nursery stakes are going to be on the next slide. So when backfilling, any additional soil you can use to create a soil berm around the hole you just dug. So you're looking kind of where your edges of the hole are. That's where the edges of your soil berm are going to be. We always like to use kind of the visual of you're creating a donut. So really creating that donut shape. This really helps with water retention so that when you go to water your tree, that water is not running off. It's actually going to the roots of that tree. Next off, we install supports. We always recommend, you can see in this photo, these are what we call lodge poles. So the ones we use, we typically buy from, nurseries. You can get them from Home Depot or other landscape stores, but these are about 8 feet tall. If you're planting a smaller tree, you generally don't need anything this vigorous, but these are for larger 15-gallon size trees. And then to attach support, we'll use, if you've ever seen green landscaping tape, some people use rubber, but you just want something elastic and with some give. You still want your tree to move. This is really important for developing a strong trunk and developing strong roots. So you're gonna wanna make sure that if your tree comes with a nursery stake, you are removing this nursery stake after planting. So now that you've had this all set up, you're going to install mulch ring over your soil berm. This is what we always recommend. Big proponents of mulch. We like any kind of organic mulch you can get. If you've ever heard of arborist chips, it's essentially what tree trimming companies get once they chip wood from fallen trees, pruned branches. They have a lot of great benefits. And then any pruning on your tree, you're going to want to keep it very low key. So keep it limited to pruning dead and broken branches. Next, we're going to look at young tree care. So mulching and weeding. And as I was just talking about, arborist mulch, it's a type of organic mulch that has a lot of great benefits. So it adds organic matter, right? Because it's natural. As it decomposes, it's breaking down nutrients and feeding that to your young tree. It helps with water retention by creating almost like a sunscreen effect on the soil. So in really hot summer days, when you're watering that tree, it's going to go down into the soil instead of just sitting on top of the mulch. It also helps with weed suppression. It's a nice organic way to do that. And protection. We plant a lot of trees in parks. And of course, parks often have grass in them. So, crews come and mow that grass. So mulch provides a nice, decent ring around it so that the mowers aren't getting too close to our newly planted trees. So mulch ring should generally be about 4 inches tall, 6 inches wide. And then it's really important to ensure that your mulch is not pushed up against the trunk of the tree. So once again, we're going to envision that donut shape. We always say you don't want a mulch volcano. So we're not looking at kind of this mounding shape. We really want it to be on the outskirts, reinforcing the work that we did with that soil berm. And then with young trees, it's important to periodically go in there and weed around the area. Hand weeding is the best thing you can do, trying to get out the roots of any weeds that may be growing in the area. And this helps to reduce competition for nutrients and competition for water. I will say trees and turf, you're going to be looking at doing this process maybe every 3 months or so because it can be pretty aggressive. Another important step with young tree establishment is structural pruning. So pruning is a bit of a black hole, I should say. So I'll just touch on the very basics of it. But anytime you're doing pruning, it's really important that you set an objective for yourself. So some things to think about: use of an area. So where's the tree planted? Is it next to a road? Is it in a park? Is it going to be shading cars? Generally, kind of the City of Davis requirements are that if you're in a park, you're pruning so that eventually you'll have clearance at 8 feet. So people are able to walk under trees. If you're pruning near a road, you're looking that your goal is eventually that your first branch isn't going to be until about 10, 12 feet up to allow clearance for trucks and such. You also want to take into account the natural growth pattern of the tree. As I talked about a little bit before, sometimes smaller trees can have a more multi-stem pattern. So not to say that you can't encourage them to grow up with a single prominent leader. Just know that if you do want to do that, it's going to take a little bit of more work, a little bit more upkeep. I will mention that with pruning, you can prune certain things almost any time of the year. You can prune deadwood almost any time of the year. I would say best practices for most pruning is to wait until after the winter. So hold off in the fall if you can. At Tree Davis, we're not always able to do this because of programming and time constraints. But generally, you want to wait until after most of the rain has passed, trees have lost their leaves, and then you can do some of your more aggressive structural pruning. So something to know is that each cut you do on a young tree can drastically alter a tree's growth. It's really important to understand the mechanisms of trees and how they grow before you do really aggressive pruning. You should know where a branch collar is on your tree. It's important that we don't cut that branch collar off, as it's a natural mechanism to prevent against decay. Trees are not like humans. So anytime you make a cut, you're introducing a wound into the tree. It is overall pruning is, beneficial for the health, but that doesn't change the fact that we create wounds on trees. They don't really generate new skin like humans do, but they will heal over time. So generally, anytime you can make a smaller cut, it's going to be more beneficial. if some older kind of schools of thought that it was helpful to dress wounds to kind of help heal them. This is no longer widely believed. So don't attempt to dress wounds caused by pruning cuts. So structural pruning, there's kind of a few steps you can take with it. So first, you're going to want to identify your central leader. In trees that have a multi-stem kind of form to them, if that's something you want to do, you're going to kind of want to look at angles, see which one that's kind of competing with each other. Maybe one's more vigorous, taller than the other. Maybe one has damage to it. So over time, it may be best just to cut that one off and let the other one take over. You're going to kind of want to examine looking at permanent branches and temporary branches. So when trees are young, they're very small. So we'll have temporary branches that we'll leave on trees when they're in their younger years until they've gotten to a height where we start to say, okay, I think I'm seeing the first permanent branch on that tree. So if a tree's in a park, that's not happening until it's about 8 feet in the air. So if you plant a small tree, it's going to be a couple of years before you're really having a permanent branch. If you're looking to do pruning yourself, I recommend using the 4Ds method. Tree People has some really great articles on this. They're a urban forestry nonprofit based out of LA. But the 4Ds stand for dead, damaged, diseased, and deranged. So these kind of start with easiest to identify and go down to a little bit harder to identify. So dead, just like is in the name, wood that is no longer living. As I mentioned earlier, you can prune dead wood off almost any time of the year. So you can do what's called a scrape test to verify if wood is dead, but generally, a lot of the time, dead wood is darker in color. It's not as flexible. And if you did that scrape test I mentioned, you would see what you think of when you think of wood. You'd see something this color. What you wouldn't see when you scrape is you can kind of just see on this tree, this green layer. So that means this is all living tissue on the outside of this tree. Damaged branches are always good to remove. If you have a wound on the tree, it can be a vector for bacteria and pests and pathogens to get in. So if you have something that's really wounded, it may be good to take that limb off completely or just take it back to the next branch. So if I had some damage out here, maybe I'd say, oh, this isn't too big of a branch, so I'm just going to take this whole thing off so that pests don't get in and spread into my main trunk. And when you're looking to really select structural pruning, you're looking at proper branch spacing. So this really comes into play once we're looking at permanent branches. When your tree's small and you're still dealing with temporary branches, you don't have to think as much about branch spacing. This is where pruning really gets more complicated. So I recommend you do reading on it, watch some videos, and of course, consult a certified arborist if you have questions. So let's take a look at some photos of kind of good pruning, bad pruning. So if we look over here, this is a Zelkova, I believe, in one of our parks in Davis. So you can see what we don't have. We do not have a clear central leader. Zelkovas have a habit of maybe coming 8 foot up, and then they turn into this like multi-stem mess of webs and trees. So you can see a lot of this is growing back into itself. There's really narrow angles in here. This is something that should have been corrected when this tree was young. So if this tree had good structural pruning done to it, in its first 1 to 5 years of after being planted, it would have been in a much better place. So you can kind of see this is another example of really narrow attachment. This is something we would not want to keep both of these. And this is a pretty big cut to make right now when the tree is young, but this is something we don't want to encourage. So you may make the best decision to take this off now. Excuse me. You can also kind of in this photo see a branch collar. You can see it again here. So keeping your cuts outside of this branch collar. You don't want to be doing what's called a flush cut. So you don't want to be cutting into this tissue here, as the branch collar provides a natural mechanism to resist decay. So this tree is a perfect example of this tree. When you're looking at your finished product, you want something more like this that has really good structure to it. So let's get into kind of common issues with urban trees. Urban trees go through a lot of stress. So this here is an elm that was planted. It's southern facing, so it gets a lot of sun. And it's a planting median, so it's sandwiched between sidewalk and a road. This sunburning probably started happening and it progressed really badly over the span of a month. So all this tissue has been broken and it will heal. You know, this wood, it's going to produce what's called wound wood. But this tree is not going to be able to conduct water and nutrients up to its stem from the roots to the leaves like it should. So urban trees really experience drought and heat heavily. These things are kind of exacerbated by being in limited growing spaces. Oftentimes soil quality can be poor, especially in newer developed areas. They might backfill with concrete. Anywhere where there's high traffic, you're going to have compaction near trees. There's reduced infiltration. Like I mentioned, you know, this is pavement, this is concrete. So the only water this tree is getting is about a little 6 feet strip. And then of course, utilities and infrastructure really limit where we're able to put trees. In addition to competition, like things from turf, and people can be a huge, huge stress. In addition to people walking over trees, sometimes people aren't next to trees. We've had people rip up trees. It happens, it's one of those things. This is a lovely example of people being a stressor to trees. So this was a tree that at the time was 3 years old, planted in a park. It got in a car accident. That's pretty hard to do when you can't move. But someone decided to drive a car through this park and do some wheelies and donuts and stuff. So this tree died pretty drastically in the span of about a month. We cut it back, hoping maybe we could establish a new central leader to it. It continued to die back until it started to develop out of basal shoots. So I kind of made a call and I was like, well, let's just see what happens. So I cut the tree all the way back to its base. I cut all these other shoots that were growing off of it off. And I decided to let this little leader here establish and see what happened. So 7 months later, this is the same tree, which is kind of, it's still like bewildering to me. This is about the same diameter thickness of the original trunk, and that's in the span of 7 months where this tree was 3 years old. So people are stressors to trees, but trees are amazingly resilient in ways that sometimes I still have a hard time fathoming. So when we talk about issues with trees, apart from, you know, normal stressors, we can look at kind of disorders trees go through. So there's abiotic and biotic disorders. Abiotic are related to non-living things. So excuse me, like I mentioned, soil and site issues, physical and mechanical injuries, potential weather-related issues. This could be frost or wind, pollution damage from, you know, bad air quality, chemical injuries such as overspray from herbicides or pesticides, limited water availability, or girdling of roots. And then we can look at biotic factors. So we're looking at pests, diseases. So a lot of times these are insects. There's a couple different varieties of insects. You can have chewing, sucking, boring, and then pathogens, bacteria, viruses, fungi, just to name a few. Diagnosing diseases and pests is really complicated. This is a bug called scale that grows on trees. This is damage from a woodpecker, which is often a sign that you have some sort of insect that is sucking out the xylem from your tree. This is an instance of the elm leaf beetle, and this is an instance of woolly aphids. So some of these things can be nuisance pests. They're not going to kill your tree, but oftentimes they're a sign that your tree is exhibiting some sort of stress. So it's kind of important to take in both abiotic factors and biotic factors when you're looking to identify. Maybe you see a pest, but there could be underlying issues still at play there. So this is a nice little graphic. I kind of like to reference sometimes. There's a variety and massive list of disease and pests that your tree can unfortunately have to deal with. But when you're looking to diagnose problems, it's helpful to start with identifying the plant. Many insects and diseases are host specific, so this can really narrow down whether you're dealing with something specific. You should look for things that are kind of out of the ordinary. So you're looking, is damage uniform? Is it in one spot? Are there holes in the leaves? Is it on one side of the canopy? Is it across the canopy? And then look to examine nearby plants and see if they're also affected. You want to examine the roots. This is kind of looking into those abiotic factors, seeing if those are at play. Maybe moisture conditions are creating a situation where your tree is stressed, and then making it more vulnerable to other pests that you might be seeing with your naked eye. And then, of course, checking the trunk, branches, and leaves to see if there's any issues. As I mentioned, diagnosing your own pests and diseases is very complicated, so ask a certified arborist. This is a tree I love to a website I love to pass on to people, treesaregood.org. You go to this find an arborist tool, you can type in your zip code and it'll output a list of certified arborists for you. And you can contact them and they're going to be kind of like certified arborists are the base level you want someone working on your tree to have. So it means they've taken an exam that shows that they've studied, plant selection, planting a tree, care of a tree, how to properly prune your tree, and essentially all the things we just talked about. And that's all I have for everybody today. So thank you.
All right. Thank you for a great talk. Lots of practical tips in there. I think I've got a couple of pages of notes here as I'm thinking about my fall planting plans. So we do have a number of questions.
Sure.
And so there were, several questions kind of relating to thinking about these non-native climate-ready species
Yeah.
versus like a native oak. And so one question is kind of where did these climate-ready trees come from? Is that like kind of a national set of trees? And like, why
Yeah.
not use, say, something from like Southern California up here?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. We get this question a lot of why don't you plant more native trees? Why aren't we doing more for native trees? And it is a really important question. It's really important to preserve our native species. But sometimes urban environments are not the place to do that, such as things like car accidents. That doesn't really happen when you're out in an oak woodland area. So in regards to that, these species, I really recommend going and looking at this climate ready research. It started about 10 years ago, and they pulled from a variety of experts suggestions from tree species. So I highlighted some from Texas, Mexico, Arizona, but there are species kind of all over California. And this is still, I would say, kind of a continuing field. So people are continuing to experiment with this idea and test it. The species I highlighted are the ones that have been tested years ago. So they're ones that we know that aren't turning into invasive species, right? So they're more safe to go out and plant in your home.
Great. So thinking about planting oaks, and so Dan was wondering if people have looked at planting, really, really small oaks to try to avoid the taproot issue, or planting them under a nurse tree or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is a huge issue, right? So generally it's kind of, even with normal trees, the smaller the container size you can go, the better. A lot of the work people do in restoration is looking at planting these oaks. So whenever available, they're using kind of skinnier and longer containers. I believe they're called T4. They're about like yay long. And that's to accommodate this taproot. This is widely seen in restoration work. An issue for us is that this isn't widely done in the nursery world. The nursery world tends to do what's safe for them, right? Because they're interested in making sales. So it is a really good idea if you have the flexibility on your own to go out and buy from native nurseries. Unfortunately, the one out kind of in the Davis Winter area just closed. But there is one in Sacramento who does great work, and you can get really good oak quality, oak stock from.
And what is that nursery in Sacramento?
The California Native Plant Society, located in Rancho
Okay.
Cordova.
Yes. Okay, great. And then kind of thinking about I guess, invasiveness, but sort of genetic invasiveness. There's a question about some of these non-native oaks. Is there any worry about them hybridizing with our native oaks?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like I mentioned, these have kind of been tested, piloted. They've done it in a variety of locations. So there's some on the UC Davis campus. There's some out in Natomas, out near Sacramento. So these are things that we're continually watching for. Um, a lot of times it can be hard to catch invasiveness, right? And they can hybridize with other oaks. But this is like a consistent issue with like the oak species. You're never going to really have, if you're collecting native acorns, anytime trees are within 1,000 feet of each other, they're going to hybridize. So it is a very valid concern. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I can add a little bit to that. Oaks are a bit of a hobby of mine.
Yeah.
So from what I've read, it seems like, the risk of hybridization kind of goes up the more closely related the species are. And so in California, we've got mostly white oaks and red oaks, and then a few golden cup oaks. And generally, you don't see any hybridization in between those groups.
Hmm.
And then, within those groups, it's the species that are closest to each other genetically that tend to be most likely to hybridize. And given that all of our California oaks are, been here a long time, they're pretty distant from oaks elsewhere in the country. So I would suspect the risk is low, though probably not zero.
Yeah.
Um, so Ken has a question about city trees in Davis. Talking about there's a Chinese tallow out in a city-owned tree in front of the house. Seems to not be in great shape. Does the city have a plan or a program for maintaining trees, or what does that look like?
Yes, yeah. So the city of Davis has their own urban forestry division. Tree Davis, we work quite closely with them. We deal primarily with young tree care. But in regards to any mature trees in Davis, if they're city owned, you can go to the city website to their urban forestry division. I'd recommend contacting their email. You can email or call them and just tell them there's an issue with your tree. They have several arborists on staff, so they'll come out, do an assessment, and kind of communicate with you any needs the tree may have.
Right. I think that was all the ones from the chat. So thinking about oaks again. I see blue oaks and valley oaks as kind of common, native oaks to plant in the area here. I know kind of, in the natives, pre-colonization situation, I don't think there were many blue oaks on the valley floor.
Mhm.
Do they typically do well here long term?
Yeah, they do okay here, interestingly enough. They're just very, very slow growing, characteristic of their species. It's kind of interesting. I would say the site conditions aren't too much different, like where you look at once you start going up in elevation, like those are pretty harsh environments. So it kind of mimics where we're looking at in urban settings.
Mm-hmm.
I will say, kind of as a funny side note, through that community canopy grant, we started planting coast live oaks. We started out with interior live oaks, which are native to the interior valley, and found they weren't doing well. So we decided to try coast live oaks, and there's a good amount of them out on the Russell Boulevard bike path if you're going out towards Winters. They've done very,
Yeah.
very well here. So
Hmm.
yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Are there any final questions for Cecilia? Just to quickly plug, our next talk will be at the end of October. That's going to be with Andrew Folks, one of Tuleyome's founders, who will be talking about hiking and trails in the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument. All right, so I'm not seeing any other questions. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Cecilia, for a great talk. And we will be posting the recording of this. So if there's any tips or tricks you want to go back and reference, it'll be up on our YouTube page.